Sugar is added to our coffee, it's baked in our favorite treats, and we even spoon it over our breakfast. And that's because we love the sweet stuff. We crave it. But are we addicted to it? It's become a very popular topic that sugar is an addiction. Have you heard of the stories in the press about Oreos being more addictive than cocaine? I believe that addiction may be a bit of an overstatement. In the clinic, I actually work with a lot of mental health patients as well as diabetes patients. And addiction is a strong word. In medicine, we use addiction to describe a tragic situation where someone's brain chemistry has been altered to compel them to repeat a substance or an activity despite harmful consequences. This is very different than the casual use of addiction when somebody says, "I'm addicted to Netflix," or "I'm addicted to love." Medical addiction changes brain chemistry to cause binging, craving, withdrawal symptoms, and sensitization. The drug analogy is always a tough one because, unlike drugs, food is necessary for survival. And not everyone has access to healthy foods without sugars at all times in their lives. Sugar is also much more prevalent and available and socially acceptable than amphetamines or alcohol, and they're harder to avoid. That said, there's also research demonstrating that sugar can stimulate the brain's reward processing center in a manner that mimics what we see with some recreational drugs. In certain individuals with certain predispositions, this can manifest as an addiction to sugary foods. As a person with the condition of diabetes, difficulty abstaining from sugar can result in damage to your body, generally to the same degree of consequences of cigarettes, alcohols, or drugs. If you're a person with diabetes who tries and fails to regularly abstain from sugar, aside from an occasional treat, you are actually continuing to have high hemoglobin A1Cs, higher than your target, because you cannot stop eating foods with sweetness. Then, in my opinion, you may be meeting the standards for a real addiction because there's a repeated pattern that has a serious and harmful consequence. This webinar is not meant to diagnose you with an addiction because I feel like addiction is too strong of a term for most people. Instead, I'm going to describe the connections with sugar. There are 3 connections with sugar: the body, the brain, the emotions. I will relay the details of these connections and the strategy for breaking the connections to sugar. The body and the mind are one unit, and they are linked by positive and negative feedback loops of neurohormones. To demonstrate this fact, think about when somebody gets scared. The brain sends a hormone called cortisol. It goes down to the adrenal gland, and it makes it release adrenaline. As a result, the heart pumps faster. So let's take a look at the positive feedback of the brain and the body that drives the connection to sugar. Generally, the brain likes sugar. It is the organ in the body that demands sugar the most for its metabolism. But also, there are areas of the brain that create addictive properties to sugar, which we won't go into detail about. First, we're going to talk about the dopamine response. Dopamine is a chemical that the brain releases when sugar is eaten. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that is a key part of the reward circuit, which is associated with addictive behavior. When a certain behavior causes excess release of dopamine, you feel a pleasurable high, and you're inclined to re-experience the high, so you repeat the behavior. The same thing happens when a person takes a drug like cocaine, because dopamine is released. This neurotransmitter release has actually been demonstrated in the lab for the release of dopamine and opioid receptors. Therefore, the scientific evidence does contribute to the reason why sugar consumption is now being called an addiction. This is a natural mechanism of the brain. It releases dopamine in response to food. At an ancient time, this served us because it would stimulate the caveman to get out of the cave to seek the food. Vegetables and nuts will actually cause a dopamine response as well, but it's to a much smaller degree. The body also follows the feedback loop because sugar in the blood triggers the release of insulin that lowers the blood sugar, and the lower blood sugar triggers the appetite. So do not blame yourself for the cravings. The problem is that the sugar and the salt exploits the natural survival mechanisms. There has actually been a research study done on newborn infants. As a very brief summary, some of the newborn infants were fed dextrose and some were not. The infants that were fed the dextrose demonstrated a very strong preference very quickly. In fact, giving dextrose to infants is proven to have some pain relieving properties and is actually used to help relieve pain prior to an IV start. I hope this example demonstrates to you that this is a very natural gut and brain connection. And those natural connections can result in the perceived need for sugar to satisfy a highly demanding and perpetuating cycle of eating sugar. It is our biological response. Last but not least, let's discuss the emotional connections to sugar. Messages from our society contribute to our thoughts of sugar. Thoughts lead to emotions, emotions lead to actions, and actions lead to habits. There are various messages and various thoughts. Messages of positive reinforcement may be telling a child, if you eat broccoli, then you get a dessert. It may be also when getting a bingo prize, that's a sweet treat. Or it may be when a child leaves a doctor's office with a sucker. There are also messages with good connotation. Think about when somebody says, you're sweet like sugar. Or maybe you have a kissy, lovey grandma that says, give me some sugar. Also, there are memories of happiness and celebration in our society with sugar. For example, eating cake on a birthday. You have all the family and friends gathering around the table just to celebrate that one person. Maybe there's a memory of being in front of a favorite cartoon, wearing PJs, eating a bowl of cereal as a child. In our society, there are messages with sugar. They're positive, they have good connotation, and they're involved in our memories of happiness and celebration. Not every person experiences sugar addiction the same. It will present differently in each person. Some people may crave the sugars or refined processed foods when they are sad, stressed, depressed, angry, happy, celebratory, or seeking the reward to the self. People may use sugar as a crutch to return to happy, or perhaps they want to augment the happy. Or maybe they have just learned the shoulds of our culture of when to eat sweets. The body, the brain, and the emotional cycles may exist at the same time in one person, or maybe it's just one of the cycles. The first step is to identify your patterns in order to individualize your strategy to overcome them. I will review some scenarios of an individual with each cycle to help you identify your profile. A person with diabetes may be in the body cycle if they are having frequent hyperglycemia or frequent hypoglycemia events. And this is because the blood sugar causes fluctuations that are a physiological trigger. Often, this stimulus is a quick onset within minutes or an hour. And the stimulus is strong, and it feels very, very real because it is. A person may be at risk for the brain cycle if he or she has never thought of sugar or processed refined carbohydrates as an addiction before. This makes sense because at the grocery stores, these foods are at the front and the bulk of the selection. And the same goes for restaurants and social gatherings. It's honestly the norm of our culture. So if a person is not aware of the brain cycle for dopamine, then they're going to be more predisposition towards picking those foods. In an individual, the brain cycle stimulus often presents as cravings, as if there's a certain food to satisfy. And that can be one way that you identify it. Ask yourself, am I hungry enough to eat chicken and broccoli? And if not, then it's probably a brain dopamine stimulus. As I mentioned, most people in our society are conditioned for the emotional connection with sugar. And this may look like when a person is on a diet. Perhaps they have not eaten sugar or any processed foods for 2 or 3 weeks, and the connection of the biological cycles of the gut and brain are completely severed. Imagine this. There is a bridge, kind of like a bridge over a river, but it has been burned to sugars. And that's a good situation to be in. But then, some sort of circumstance comes up. It creates an emotional trigger, and the bridge to the sugar reappears. Let's go through a scenario of happy feelings rebuilding that bridge. Let's say a person is on a low-carb, sugar-free diet for 3 months. But then he or she goes to a family gathering and it triggers happy memories of togetherness, or maybe he or she wants to please someone they love by eating their special dessert dish. Has anybody been in this? Next, let's go through a scenario of bad feelings that can build that bridge again. A person is at a work party. He or she is feeling social anxiety or uncomfortable for whatever reason. Maybe they're feeling bored. Maybe there's anxiety that it's just a waste of time. So to soothe that feeling, they go to the dessert bar. Finally, I've also discussed that connection to sugar that's based on the shoulds in our culture or society that has incorporated thoughts. For example, when a person thinks, I've been good this week, I should reward myself. And rewards are sweet things. That's the thought that needs to change. Breaking the cycles for your connections to sugar is where diabetes coaching is most valuable. Furthermore, in my opinion, if you have a sugar addiction, then this is one of the first things to correct. Remember the picture of the addiction cycle. If this cycle repeats day after day, then it creates pathways in your mind. A perfect analogy is a tornado. A tornado is like a sugar addiction. A tornado is basically just a cycling pattern of wind created from an unstable environment, and it creates pathways. When you are living with a sugar addiction, you are in that tornado, and it is bigger than you, and you will not muscle it out. So the best thing that you can do for yourself is to get out of that tornado so that you can think clearly. The first step to change is to move out of the high spinning wind and into the eye of the tornado. And that is right now in this webinar, because you are learning your knowledge on sugar and you are learning self-awareness. But you are still not out of that tornado until you decide to make a change. The second step to change is when you decide to step through the tornado. And that means that you push yourself through a few hard weeks of no sugar. And that is where the health coach comes in handy to help you develop a plan and strategies and the support to execute that plan. Nobody wants the alternative to continue to eat sugar and step back into that tornado. That tornado creates day after day of cycles of sugar addiction that takes you away from your goals. So do not travel too far in this tornado of sugar addiction, because the pathway is to the demise of your success for diabetes self-management. I encourage you to reach out, grab onto a stable structure like a diabetes coach. And I believe it could be one of the most helpful purposes of a diabetes coach. And now, proceed to the next videos to gain more knowledge about sugar and to help you to take your first step to ending your connection to sugar. Thank you for watching this webinar.